of digging up the trenches. In Belgium's Flanders fields, a team of archaeologists are excavating two frontline trenches of the First World War. The Allied trench has revealed dozens of artifacts, pointing to each stage of trench warfare. But at the German trench, 5 days of digging reveals only signs of destruction.
My first impression is it's a fragment of a hand grenade.
After cleaning, we've got the German bike helmet.
The team thinks the German trench was crushed under heavy artillery fire. But what would have made this spot such an important target?
Exactly the same for the Germans. They sat there for 2 years.
That's right.
Peeking at each other.
Historian Peter Barton calls on the help of Peter Chasseau, a military historian and cartographer.
In the first place, it's certainly hard to believe there was several fierce battles here, and in
They head across no man's land
try and get over.
to help solve the mystery of the blasted German trench.
We're in the German trench again. We've got concrete work here. And judging by the position on Peter's map, it's quite possibly it's very, very close to the spot where we seem to have a machine gun marked.
Yeah, we've got certainly on the trench map a German machine gun position marked exactly in the trench where we are here.
The position of this machine gun post may illustrate another tactic of the trenches. Salients were bulges in the line, allowing forces to almost surround the enemy. But on a smaller scale, salients could create a different advantage. Archaeological field technician Frankie Weifels.
And I'm certain to say that from here, the front line runs from here, a shelter, probably machine post, runs on, another shelter, and runs on about more than 30 meters, makes a 90-degree turn right. That's the front line on the west. We've got the front line facing south.
The destroyed machine gun post that the team has found was located in a small bulge in the German line. This allowed it to fire in a broad swath into no man's land.
The most dangerous thing in no man's land was the fixed machine gun. What they would do is fix a machine gun on a line just to almost cut the grass in no man's land, knee height.
By day, stepping into no man's land was suicide. So soldiers started working the night shift. Operations would begin just after dark. Each night, all along the front, hundreds of soldiers would crawl out of the trenches. It was the only time barbed wire could be repaired. But German machine guns were always on guard.
Pass gut auf. Ich denke, die sind da.
Working in silence became a matter of life or death.
At the beginning of the war, barbed wires hung on posts, and this was a very dangerous thing at night because you had to hammer these posts into the ground, and the noise could be picked up by enemy machine gunners. So they would just spray the area when they heard that activity going on.
The telltale sound of men working the wire got thousands killed until the British borrowed an enemy solution.
It's called a screw picket, a German invention which was taken up immediately by the British. And the reason why it was taken up is because this, unlike the timber stakes, was silent in its application. So all you did was you placed the point in the ground and started turning, just like a corkscrew. And once that was in, you just attached your wire to it, to the loops up here, put as many of these in as you wanted without making a sound.
But fixing barbed wire wasn't the only reason to leave trenches at night. Darkness was also a perfect time to spy on the enemy. Spy planes could only do so much. They were too high to see new machine gun nests and fortifications. Sometimes, the only answer was to take a close look in person. And trench raids were the answer. Invented in early 1915, the objective was to infiltrate a German trench, kill the enemy, and escape with at least one live prisoner to ply for intelligence. One soldier chronicled his terrifying experience on a trench raid in 1915.
Don't look back.
We muffled our rifle slings and accoutrements so that no little noise should betray us. The last thing we did before going out was to give each other a stiff dose of rum. Then there were a few whispered farewells and a handshake or two. As soon as we passed our entanglements, we got down on our bellies and began to crawl. In the slow advance to the enemy's line, I experienced a prolonged state of consciousness during which I hung over a pit of fear, weighted down by a long and vivid anticipation. This silent agony of deliberate approach. Captain Herbert Reed.
Out in no man's land, the raiders wait for their chance to strike. They don't dare move as long as German machine guns are in place. For the raid to succeed, this target must be destroyed. Now, back at the site, Barton and Chassot believe they know why this section of the German trench was destroyed.
Yeah, what we've got here is a trench map prepared for a British trench raid. We know from this plan that in early 1917 they executed this raid. It happened right here on this spot, and that German machine gun emplacement there was targeted by the British 4.5-inch howitzers very specifically to destroy or neutralize that machine gun post so that it couldn't fire across no man's land and knock out this British raiding party that was coming across.
The raiders readied themselves for the attack, waiting for Allied shells to obliterate the machine gun nests. With the machine gun nest destroyed, the raiders could launch their attack.
Trench raids could be very, very bloody. They were, for the information which they gained, they were later, after the war, considered ludicrously costly because you always had casualties, you always had deaths, and very often you discovered very little.
With survival rates as low as 50%, thousands were injured or died in these trench raids. No one could win the war this way. Both sides continued to search for a way out of the trenches. And as archaeologists will soon discover, stalemate sent the trench fighters even deeper underground.
There's a sense here that it might be some kind of trench shelter.
And created an engineering marvel. With the war locked in stalemate, in the winter of 1916, German and Allied soldiers hunkered down in their trenches, worn out by boredom, cold, and the threat of sudden death.
Heavy gales sprang up during the 2 nights, and it was the coldest we had experienced in the firing lines. the men often coming in again with the rations being nearly frozen. Private John F. Mould.
Across no man's land, Germans endured the same hardships. The war was defined by boredom, punctuated by moments of terror. There was no telling when the Allies might launch a trench raid or an artillery attack.
I shall not easily forget those long winter nights in the front line. In the dark, we were prey to all sorts of unreasoning fancies. A tree stump, a hummock of earth, a coil of wire took on a new and menacing forms, and in the light of a star shell, could seem to be moving towards us. Private Frederick Elias Noakes.
The soldiers had expected to be home by Christmas 1914, but the war was dragging on with no end in sight. Now, the dig discovers how these cold trenches were made into a home away from home.
We have a rectangular feature over there.
First impression looking at this is that we've got an area which is roughly square shaped. It's got fabric, it's got timber, and there's a sense here that it might be some kind of trench shelter.
Once it was clear that the war would last not for months, but years, millions of men needed a home in this land of water and mud.
This was the job of the Royal Engineers for the British and the job of the pioneers, or pioneer, for the Germans. It was their job to devise the trench systems so men could live in it. This was a home. What we're looking at here is not just a trench, it's where men lived.
An underground metropolis took root behind the trenches. Up to 3,000 men lived and slept in each section. Engineers rigged kitchens and latrines. A military base with all the amenities but one: sunlight.
In fact, more people lived underground in 1917 in the Ypres salient than live on the surface now in the city of Ypres.
Today, only relics are left of the men who lived here.
That's a standard British spoon.
It's rubber.
We're getting some evidence of home from home here in the trenches. So I think we're looking at a position occupied probably not by ordinary soldiers, but by officers, by NCOs.
For some officers, like Second Lieutenant Robin Skeggs, living conditions were even sometimes enjoyable.
My dear Granny, I'm writing this sitting in my garden at the back of my dugout. It's a lovely afternoon. We've laid a certain amount of turf already, and as I write, there are 3 youngsters around me, as busy as they know how. They thoroughly enjoy doing a bit of gardening for the officer. You would like my garden seat, sheltered from the wind in a snug little corner which gets the sun all day.
Lower ranks have fewer creature comforts.
Everything was very carefully designed, just like the civilian social structure. Offices, the higher classes were separated from the men, from the great unwashed. And this was absolutely true in trench warfare. Parcels and letters were hugely important in the trenches. If families could afford to send parcels, then they would send huge amounts of food of all kinds, delicacies, sweet foods, cakes, fruit. Everything could be posted. You found, officers having pâté de foie, mince pies at Christmas time. It wasn't uncommon at all. You find lists of parcel contents, and there's one here, and we've got a tin of cocoa, a tin of tomato soup, and the recipient has marked whether he liked it or not, VG, please do not send again. Here he's got in front of a bottle of Bovril, a tin of tobacco. So they're quite well catered for.
Even so, most soldiers enjoyed less fanciful fare.
The staple diet for the soldier in the trenches was bully beef, which is literally corned beef, and that arrived in tins. You got that virtually every day. This material was used to give the army food a bit of flavour.
But just as trench life became more bearable, a new weapon found its way into the shelters. Mustard gas was a deadly chemical that could seep into the dugouts, attacking trench fighters where they slept. Delivered in explosive shells, mustard gas was an oily brown liquid that would turn into gas.
It was especially dangerous if men in cold conditions had got splashed with this stuff and then went underground into a dugout, and this happened several times. In the cold, it did not turn into gas, it was still liquid on your clothes. When you got underground in a warm atmosphere, it turned to gas, and the whole dugout full of men could have been gassed.
Oh, get up, you got gas on you! Oh my God!
It turned that quickly from liquid to gas, it could gas a whole dugout full of men. And particularly on the soft parts of your body, it just ate through your body. If you inhaled it, it ate out of your body from the inside. It would get into your lungs and eat its way out of your body. And this was by far the most lethal form of gas.
In 1917 and 1918, thousands died from the effects of mustard gas.
Gas cases are terrible. They cannot breathe lying down or sitting up. Their lungs are gone, literally burnt out. Some have their eyes and faces eaten away by gas and their body covered in first-degree burns. One boy today screaming to die, the entire top layer of his skin burnt from face and body. I gave him an injection of morphine. When will it end? Nurse Shirley Millard.
Archaeologists will look for the answer in the trenches as Peter Barton goes in search of the sites of a little-known chapter in the war.
We must ignore what we see on the surface here and dive into another dimension, a dimension which is beneath our feet.
The war in the tunnels. On the outskirts of Ypres, Belgium, a farmer's field is revealing the weapons, structures, and artifacts of the First World War. In 1916, it seemed this was a war no one would win. But in a nearby field, there is evidence of a deadly solution. Historian Peter Barton goes looking for its traces.
When we look at these battlefields, we must ignore what we see on the surface here and dive into another dimension, a dimension which is beneath our feet.
Planners on both sides of the line enlisted a new breed of soldier, the underground tunneler.
It was the most barbaric form of warfare on the Western Front. And as I say, it was endless, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
Underground tunneling and mining became a complex battle tactic.
You sank a shaft in your own trench, you dug under no man's land at various depths. A tunnel big enough to work in, maybe 5 feet high, 4 feet wide. You dug that tunnel as quietly as you possibly could so that the enemy could not hear you digging the tunnel. You dug out a chamber once you were underneath his trenches. You filled that with explosive, and at a chosen time, usually in conjunction with an infantry attack or a raid, you'd blow that mine. those people who are directly in line with it would be vaporized or buried or blown out of their trenches into no man's land. They were literally blown out. And that would allow your attacking infantry force to take that front line trench much more easily.
By 1916, a vast honeycomb of mining galleries and tunnels lay beneath the Ypres salient.
The curious thing about these tunneling companies was that they were formed not from soldiers, but they were formed from civilians. And the first tunneling company were formed from men who'd been working in the sewers of Manchester on a Thursday. And the following Monday, they were working in France and Flanders. No military training, they couldn't even salute. They were given a rifle, it was taken off them straight away because they thought they'd shoot each other. But they'd not come here to fight, they'd come to dig, and they all knew that.
Even today, the scars of collapsed tunnels can be seen on the surface of Flanders fields.
Here's a good example of a recent collapse. You can see, because there's no vegetation grown around the hole, it's a fairly recent one. And if we were to hire a machine here and just dig straight down here, we go straight into the Canadian tunnels, which were dug in 1916. This kind of crown hole is evident throughout the whole of the Ypres salient. It's more prevalent up here because of the sandiness of the ridge, but wherever you go, you'll find collapses, some big, some small. Farmers have lost tractors in these. They regularly lose cows. They're standing there and they disappear underground.
As each side tried to tunnel under the enemy, detecting and destroying enemy tunneling became a deadly craft.
If you picked up a German tunnel coming in your direction and found out exactly where it was, that gave you a huge advantage. So you could let them carry on digging, listening to them all the time, tracking their progress, until they got to the point where you calculated that it was a risk. And at that point, this is where the barbarity comes into this, the primitive warfare.
If one or the other heard his opponent working, the direction and level was obtained, and a torpedo was set in a hole bored by a special borer, the angle of the hole set to the correct position to strike his workings, and wired back to an exploder.
Canadian miner Lieutenant John Westacott.
At a chosen point, you decided, now we blow. You run your wires back. You blow that 100-pound charge. You murdered those men. In the summer of 1916 here, the Germans made a massive attempt to capture this ground. The tunnellers who were underground at that time knew there was something going on. When they came up from their spell of work in the morning, they came up into what was their front line, and it was full of Germans. They'd taken the trench during the night. Nobody had told the tunnellers. The Germans saw the Canadian tunnellers and dived back down the shafts, chasing them, after them.
Lieutenant John Westacott was there.
We were equipped with revolvers and grenades, but the best weapon of all underground workings was a specially made knife with a blade about 5 inches long, which was fitted to a brass frame over our hand. This weapon was silent in action.
For 24 hours, they fought hand-to-hand with grenades, with bayonets, with rifles, anything they could fight with.
Die Engländer müssen hier sein. Sieh genau hin.
Ah, sieh hier! Go! Get up! There's another one right there! Go, go, go!
Hundreds of men died in the tunnels. Some are still there.
This memorial here is marking, immediately within this area where we are now, 13 men who were killed underground.
90 years later, the men still lie where they died, entombed in their tunnels. In the spring of 1916, 20,000 tunnelers began the largest underground mining operation in history, the earthquaking of Messine Ridge. Held by the Germans since 1914, Messine Ridge was little more than a series of hilltops. But from here, the Germans could observe and fire on Allied troops all over the salient. One of the most important points on Messine Ridge was a hummock known as Hill 60.
Whereas another one of those places in the salient which was absolutely key for observation, Hill 60. And when you're on top of the hill looking back towards Ypres over there, you get this fantastic panoramic view. If you're on top looking the other direction, you would have got a panoramic view of the German line. So the Germans wanted to keep it, we wanted to take it.
The idea was nothing less than to blow Hill 60 and much of the Messine Ridge to oblivion. Over almost 2 years of clandestine work, a honeycomb of tunnels was dug under the Germans on the ridge. Long tunnels burrowed hundreds of yards behind enemy lines. At the end of these, large underground chambers were packed with explosives right under the Germans.
The favored explosive by the tunnels was something called ammonal. It was designed specifically for its lifting effect. It was a medium explosive. High explosive would make a sharp crack to break a railway line, if you like. Low explosive, like gunpowder, is too slow to lift these massive amounts of earth from 100 feet down here, for instance. Millions of tons of earth.
As work continued underground, German soldiers manning the hills had no idea that tons of ammonal explosives were planted below their feet.
It could take 6 weeks, day and night, to load. There wasn't a gap anywhere.
In total, 19 charges were laid along the ridge. At Hill 60, tunnels 2 miles long were built to deliver the explosives.
So by dawn on June the 7th, 1917, every one of these 19 charges was in place. Part of the biggest explosive charge ever planted in history.
Just after midnight on June 7th, Allied commanders launched the most powerful preliminary bombardment of the war. Then, at 3:10 a.m., the mines were triggered. What followed was the largest man-made explosion up to that point in history. A cataclysmic blast heard as far away as London. 25,000 Germans were instantly atomized or buried alive. The detonation of the mines dramatically changed the landscape.
What we see here is the Caterpillar crater. This is 70,000 pounds of ammonal planted 110 feet below the ground. It's actually a mass grave. It's not just a crater, it's a mass grave. 800 men died in this explosion alone, and they're still beneath our feet today.
Just minutes after the detonations, 150,000 Allied troops surged up the ridge into air thick with blood and dust.
When the infantry took this area after the mines had gone up, they found all the pillboxes still in the front edge of the wood there. And had done that and crushed them. They found the men just standing upright, crushed to death. The two trench sides had come together.
The explosions enabled the Allies to move forward 3,000 yards, capturing 10 miles of the ridge. It was the first major success in 3 years. At the dig site, archaeologists are about to find clues to the last bloody days in these trenches.
I shouldn't be this close to this shell. It scares the living daylights out of me, quite honestly.
In Flanders Fields, archaeologists have just 2 days left to find clues to the last dramatic days of these trenches. For 3 years, this was home to hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But in 1917, the mining of Messines Ridge by the Allies began a new stage in the war. The next step was to launch a massive infantry offensive. It would be known as the Third Battle of Ypres. And it would be launched from these very trenches.
What we've got here is the topsoil on the top, where we've got about ½ meter of topsoil. And then coming down here, we start hitting a different color. And this color is purely there because this is the remnants of metal in the First World War, most of which came from the sky. It's shell fire. Because of the intensity of that shell fire, the First World War has actually become a geological feature.
In the weeks before the Third Battle of Ypres, the Allies launched a fierce artillery attack against the Germans. The enemy retaliated, and 90 years later, there are many deadly reminders at the Allied trench site.
So for some reason, this one hasn't gone off, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't go off in the future. If someone came along and gave that a big knock, that could very easily explode, go bang, and we would all be blasted to pieces where we stand now. So I'm very close to oblivion here.
The war's great killer, artillery, was becoming even more efficient with developments like the Grays fuse.
As soon as that shell even touched the ground, it would explode on the surface of the ground, and the splinters, steel splinters from that shell, would all fly sideways.
The kind of damage which these things could do would simply, men would simply cease to exist. They would just disappear. For instance, on a misty morning, you could be left just with a mist of blood in the air. This is the kind of thing which could happen with these massive shells.
Even though the Allies had managed to hang on to the city of Ypres, it was still within range of German artillery. Over 3 years, the city was slowly pulverized. By 1917, Ypres had been reduced to rubble. Soldiers became expert in identifying the different kinds of incoming enemy shells.
The names that the troops gave to the shells often came from the sound of the shell in flight and the explosion itself. The name Jack Johnson was given to a big black shell burst because of the black boxer called Jack Johnson who was around at that time. So the names of these shells, whiz-bangs, for example, the high-velocity German field gun shell, the whiz and the bang of the explosion happened very, very quickly next to each other.
By 1917, shelling was approaching its zenith. In July 1917 alone, the Allies fired over 4 million shells into German positions. It was the deafening prelude to the Third Battle of Ypres.
The whole place was nothing but a mass of bursting shells. The deadly sound as they exploded and the awful vibrations just followed, trying the nerves of everyone around. Quite a few had to be taken away with shell shock. During the time this barrage was taking place, shrapnel was flying around in all directions. Private John F. Mould.
Shell blast could cause death by concussion at 10 yards, rupturing spleen and kidneys, leaving no marks on the body.
The effect of shelling could be utterly devastating upon the nervous system. People simply broke down under shelling. Shell shock. There are many times you find reports of people becoming literally gibbering wrecks. But everyone has a different threshold. Some people could stand it just that bit longer.
Shell shock took a terrible toll. By the end of the war, 30,000 men had gone mad.
People could simply fall apart and never recover. It's only 3 years since the last veteran died who'd been in a home for the whole of his life. He never got over being shelled.
Under this metallic thunder, 300,000 men prepared to charge out of their trenches. Three weeks of artillery fire and rain had transformed no man's land into a quagmire. Conditions were poor, but the generals would wait no longer. On July 31st, 1917, soldiers readied themselves to go over the top into a certain hail of steel and bullets. Frederick Noakes describes his final moments before scrambling over the top.
I think that half hour was probably the worst I have ever spent. Private Frederick Elias Noakes.
From the records, we know precisely what happened just before the attack on July the 31st, 1917. They had a cup of tea and they had sausages and potatoes before they went over the top. I suspect a tablespoonful of rum might have followed. And then it was a question of saying potential goodbyes.
Most soldiers felt that going over the top was the greatest test any man would ever face.
As time went past, apprehension became acute as I weighed my chances for surviving the attack. No, I could not so easily give up. The grip of life on me was tightening, and more than ever, I wanted to live. Liaison Officer Paul Lucien Mays.
And then when the whistle blew, it's these very trenches which they climbed out of into the machine gun fire.
It was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The exact death toll has never been established. 68,000 men are thought to have been wounded or killed. In spite of huge losses, over the next 4 months, Allied soldiers advance as far as Passchendaele. Allies again dig into trenches, but not for long. Soldiers in 1918 would witness the arrival of new tactics and technology that would finally defeat the trenches. In Flanders Fields, an historic dig is coming to an end. Belgium's winter is about to set in, but nothing can dampen the archaeologist's sense of achievement. In just 2 weeks, they have uncovered 2 entire frontline trenches and found more artifacts than many thought was possible. The trenches will soon be filled in again, laid to rest once more under farmers' crops.
Some people say, well, it's not worth it. You know, you're doing all the effort to get all the trenches clear, to get all the things between the A-frames, and then you're just covering it. So why are you doing it? Well, I think it's really worth the effort. That's how we do archaeology.
The dig site has revealed evidence of each stage of trench warfare. In the British trench, duck boards and A-frames. Part of the ingenious architecture of a fortress built in often sodden ground.
And what the archaeologists have done here has got a pair of scissors and just cut through the ribbon of the Western Front. And this little tiny excavation is that little cut.
The dig uncovered clues that explain why soldiers first dug these trenches.
Trenches simply appeared in this landscape because men had to take cover from steel, from bullets and from shrapnel. It's as simple as that.
For 3 years, there was no way to break the stalemate. Gas attacks, sniping, trench raids, artillery fire, every tactic failed. But in 1918, the last year of the war, the riddle of how to break the stalemate was finally solved. New primitive tanks burst through even the sturdiest trench lines. And precision bombing blew strongholds to pieces. When the war finally ended, the trenches were filled in. In wars to come, generals try to avoid trenches, now synonymous with stalemate. But soon, the few First World War soldiers who are still with us will pass away.
This dig is being done at a time when there's a handful of First World War veterans still left alive. There's 4 in Britain, there's 4 in Germany, 3 in Australia. The First World War we're right on that point where the First World War is passing from memory into history, and we can never go back again.
As these last veterans pass away, the artifacts they left behind will be the only reminders of what happened here. Objects that speak across the generations. On the last day of the dig, November 11th, the archaeologists share their findings with the people of Flanders before entrusting them to museums around the world.
You just think about the people who were there and the sacrifices they made, and exactly the same on the other side of no man's land as well. It's no longer them and us, it's no longer British against German, it's just a slice of history which means so much to people from all over the world even today.
In time, the soldiers' names will fade.
So it's difficult to put it into words, really. It's a great privilege. It's something you'll never forget. And it makes you feel extremely humble and lucky that in the decades of my life, I've never had to go to war.
Millions of men lived and died in the trenches of World War I, and many of their bodies still lie here, buried beneath Flanders fields. But thanks to the archaeologists, their sacrifice will not be forgotten.